Close your eyes for a moment and let your breath slow down, finding a natural, easy rhythm. Imagine the warm, golden light of a California afternoon, the way the sun dips low over the Santa Cruz Mountains, casting long, soft shadows across the valley. There is a stillness here, a quiet hum of nature mixing with the silent energy of ideas, deep in the heart of Palo Alto. Here, the air smells of eucalyptus and dry grass, heated by the day's sun, and cooling now as the evening fog begins to roll in gently from the ocean, wrapping the world in a soft grey blanket. In this place, where the sandstone buildings of Stanford University glow with an amber hue, history and the future seem to walk hand in hand. It is a landscape of ambition, yes, but also of deep reflection. It is here that we find the beginning of a story about family, about the weight of legacy, and about the quiet, often lonely courage required to see the truth when the world prefers a beautiful illusion. Let us drift back to a time before the noise, before the headlines, to the quiet sanctity of a grandfather's house. Picture a room filled with the scent of old leather and polished wood, the comforting aroma of a life well lived. This is the home of George Shultz, a man who stood as a pillar of history, a statesman who had walked the corridors of power, who had carried the weight of nations on his shoulders. But here, in the soft light of his living room, he was simply a grandfather. Imagine the feeling of that room, the heavy curtains drawn just enough to filter the light, the shelves lined with books that hold the secrets of diplomacy and economics, the silence that feels heavy, not with tension, but with wisdom. To his grandson, Tyler, this man was a titan, a figure carved from the bedrock of integrity. There is a specific kind of warmth that exists between a grandfather and a grandson, a bond that skips the friction of parenthood and rests solely in admiration and love. Tyler looked at George, with his heavy eyebrows and deliberate way of speaking, and saw a compass. He saw the true north of moral character. It is a profound thing to look at an elder and see not just a person, but an ideal, a foundation upon which you hope to build your own life. In this atmosphere of reverence, a new element was introduced. It arrived not with a crash, but with a whisper of promise. A young woman, brilliant, intense, with eyes that seemed to hold a vision of a better world, entered this sanctuary. Elizabeth Holmes. She spoke of a future where suffering could be diminished, where a single drop of blood could tell the story of a person's health, saving lives through early detection, making the complex simple, making the painful painless. To Tyler, a young man with a mind sharpened by science and a heart open to possibility, this vision was mesmerizing. It wasn't just about technology, it was about humanity. It was about healing. And seeing his grandfather, the man he admired most in the world, embrace this vision, gave it a solidity, a weight of truth. If George Shultz believed, then surely the dream was real. The two worlds, the stoic, proven past of the grandfather and the shimmering, innovative future of the founder, seemed to merge perfectly in that living room. And so, Tyler stepped into that world. Imagine the transition from the warm, wood-panelled safety of the family home to the stark, bright whiteness of a laboratory. The air in a lab is always different. It is scrubbed clean, cool and recycled, carrying the faint, sterile scent of isopropyl alcohol and vinyl. There is a hush in these spaces. The only sounds are the rhythmic whir of centrifuges, the soft click of pipettes, the hum of refrigerators keeping samples at precise temperatures. Tyler entered Theranos with the wide-eyed hope of youth. He wanted to be part of the solution, to contribute to this great shifting of the world. He was a biologist, a thinker, someone who found comfort in data, in the reliable, repeatable nature of science. Science, after all, is a language of truth. It does not lie. It does not pretend. It simply is. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the atmosphere began to shift, subtly at first, like the temperature dropping when the sun goes behind a cloud. The work, the daily rhythm of the lab, began to feel out of sync with the grand vision he had heard discussed in his grandfather's home. Imagine standing in a room full of expensive machinery, watching the lights blink, waiting for results that do not come, or results that do not make sense. There is a specific kind of confusion that arises when reality refuses to align with expectation. It starts as a small knot in the stomach, a quiet question asked in the privacy of one's own mind. Did I miss something? Am I looking at this wrong? Tyler would look at the Edison machines, the proprietary devices that were supposed to be the miracle, and he would see the flaws. He would see the errors. He would see the data drifting away from the truth. And yet, around him, the world continued to applaud. The narrative remained perfect. The vision remained pristine. It is a lonely feeling, to be the only one noticing a crack in the glass, while everyone else is admiring the view. The silence in the lab became heavier. It was no longer the peaceful silence of concentration, but the thick, stifling silence of secrets. Tyler began to feel a dissonance, a vibration that rattled his very sense of self. He was a Shultz, a name that meant integrity, and he was a scientist, a profession that demanded proof. Every day, he walked into that building, passing through the security doors, walking down the gleaming hallways, and he felt the weight of the shadow growing. He would go home, perhaps driving back through the hills, the golden light now feeling a bit more distant, the fog a bit more obscuring. He would think of his grandfather. He would think of the pride in the old man's eyes when they talked about the company. George Shultz sat on the board of directors. He was a champion of this dream. To question the company was, in a painful, complicated way, to question his grandfather's judgment. To question the hero he had looked up to his entire life. This is where the true struggle began. Not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in the quiet chambers of a young man's heart. The struggle between the comfort of belonging and the cold, hard demand of the truth. It is easy to stay silent, to let the current carry you along, to trust that those with more power, more age, more experience must know what they are doing. It is so very easy to close your eyes and drift. But Tyler could not close his eyes. The data was there, bright and undeniable on the screens. The discrepancy between what was said to the public and what happened on the bench was a chasm that he could not cross. He tried to speak, gently at first, asking questions, pointing out anomalies. He approached his superiors with the respect of a junior employee, assuming there was a misunderstanding, assuming they would want to know, to fix, to correct. Instead of answers, he found walls. He found a culture that demanded belief over evidence, loyalty over reality. The air in the office grew colder. The smiles grew tighter. The sense of isolation deepened. Imagine sitting in your car outside the building, gripping the steering wheel, taking a deep breath before going inside. The dread, the heavy, sinking feeling of knowing that you are walking into a place where the truth is not welcome. And yet, holding on to that internal compass, the one his grandfather had unknowingly helped him calibrate, he realized, slowly, painfully, that to honor the legacy of his grandfather, he might have to defy him. That to protect the name Shultz, he might have to stand against the man who bore it. It was a paradox, a riddle that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the trees outside his window. The grandeur of the Silicon Valley dream, the billionaires, the magazine covers, the accolades, all of it began to look like a stage set, flimsy and hollow. And there, standing in the wings, was a young man with a heavy heart, holding a lantern of truth, wondering if he dared to light it, knowing that the flame might burn down the very house he loved. As we rest here, in this moment of contemplation, let us appreciate the quiet strength it takes to simply see things as they are, to trust one's own eyes, to listen to that small, still voice inside that says, "This is not right." It is a gentle power, but it is the power that moves mountains, the power that eventually, inevitably, brings the dawn. The morning sun in Palo Alto has a particular quality, a golden, hazy warmth that seems to promise innovation and clarity. It washes over the sandstone buildings of the university, it glitters on the leaves of the eucalyptus trees, and it reflects off the glass facades of the office parks where the future is being written. But for Tyler, walking into the headquarters of Theranos each day, that sunlight felt distant, separated from him by layers of tinted glass and security protocols. Inside, the air was cool, conditioned, recycled. The atmosphere was hushed, not with the peaceful silence of a library, but with the heavy, guarded silence of a vault. He would sit at his station, surrounded by the hum of machinery, the Edison devices that were supposed to change the world. They were small boxes, sleek and unassuming, yet they held a chaos within them that only a few could see. Tyler looked at the data on his screen, rows and rows of numbers that refused to align, graphs that spiked and fell without rhythm or reason. It was like trying to read a map where the roads kept shifting, where north became south, and the destination remained forever out of reach. He tried to reconcile what he cheats on the screen with what he heard in the all-hands meetings. There, under the bright lights, Elizabeth would speak with such conviction, her voice low and steady, painting a picture of a world without needles, without pain, a world where health was transparent and accessible. It was a beautiful picture. It was the picture his grandfather had bought into, heart and soul. It is a profound thing to want to believe in something so much that the desire itself becomes a kind of blindness. Tyler began to draft emails. He sat in the glow of his monitor, his fingers hovering over the keys, measuring the weight of his words. He was not trying to be a rebel. He was a scientist, and science is a discipline of honesty. It is a conversation with reality. If the results are not there, you cannot wish them into existence. He wrote to Elizabeth. He wrote to the leadership, gently pointing out the discrepancies, the errors in the validation reports, the drifting baselines. He thought, with the naivety of the honest, that they would want to know, that they would thank him for finding the cracks in the foundation so they could be repaired. But the replies, when they came, were not grateful. They were cold, sharp, dismissive. They told him he did not understand the bigger picture. They told him he was cynical. The silence in the lab deepened around him. He began to feel the eyes of others, the watchful gaze of a culture that prioritized loyalty over truth. He felt the isolation wrapping around him like a fog, a thick, damp mist that muffled his voice and obscured his path. And then there were the visits to his grandfather's house. This home, which had always been a sanctuary, a place of warmth and wisdom, began to change in Tyler's eyes. He would drive there, the tires of his car humming on the asphalt, his stomach tight with a nervous energy that he could not shake. He would walk through the front door into the familiar scent of old books, polished wood, and the faint, comforting aroma of pipe tobacco that seemed to linger in the curtains of the past. He would find George sitting in his study, or perhaps in the living room, surrounded by the mementos of a life spent in service to the nation. Photographs with presidents, medals, awards, the physical evidence of a man who knew how to weigh the fate of nations. Tyler would sit across from him, sinking into the soft cushions, feeling like a child again, yet burdened with the heavy knowledge of an adult. He tried to explain. He tried to speak of sensitivity and specificity, of assay variations and quality control. He tried to use the language of science to bridge the gap. "The machine doesn't work, grandfather," he would say, his voice quiet, respectful, but firm. "The results are wrong. We are hurting people." But George Shultz, the statesman who had stared down global superpowers, could not see the enemy within his own investment. He would look at Tyler with eyes that had seen so much history, and yet, in this moment, saw only a grandson who was losing his way. Elizabeth was a frequent guest in this house. She had sat in these same chairs, charmed the same room, woven her narrative into the very fabric of the family's trust. To George, she was the visionary. She was the new age. And Tyler, he was just a young man who didn't understand how the world of disruption worked. The conversations became circular, repetitive, painful loops of logic that went nowhere. There is a specific kind of heartbreak that comes when you realize you cannot save someone from their own belief. When the person you respect most in the world looks at you and sees an obstacle rather than an ally. One evening, the tension in the room was palpable. The air felt thin, charged with unspoken words. George told Tyler that Elizabeth had assured him everything was fine, that the technology was perfect, that Tyler was the problem. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. It was a dismissal, not just of Tyler's concerns, but of his judgment, of his integrity. Tyler looked around the room, at the heavy drapes, the ticking grandfather clock, the shadows lengthening in the corners as the sun began to set. He realized then that he could not stay, not at the company, and not in this comfortable illusion. The house of Shultz, built on a foundation of service and truth, was being used to prop up a facade. And if he stayed, if he remained silent, he would become part of that facade. He would become another layer of paint over the rotting wood. Leaving Theranos was not a dramatic exit with shouting and slamming doors. It was a quiet, trembling departure. He packed a small box. He walked past the security guards, past the tinted glass, and out into the parking lot. The California air hit his face, fresh and indifferent. The world outside was still turning. The traffic was still moving on El Camino Real. The sun was still shining. But Tyler was now an outsider. He had no job. He was estranged from his grandfather. He was alone. And yet, as he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, he felt the first faint stirrings of something else. A lightness, The burden of the lie was gone. He was no longer carrying the weight of the impossible. But the story was not over. In fact, the true test was just beginning. Because the truth, once held, demands to be shared. It is not enough to simply walk away from a fire. One must warn the neighbours. Tyler knew that patients were still walking into Walgreens, rolling up their sleeves, trusting a machine that he knew was flawed. He knew that doctors were making decisions based on data that was nothing more than a guess. He began to sleep with a phone by his bed, a burner phone, fearful of surveillance. The paranoia that had permeated the lab followed him home. He checked the windows. He watched the cars parked on his street. The grandeur of the Silicon Valley dream had dissolved completely, leaving behind a landscape of fear and intimidation. Lawyers were mentioned. Threats were veiled but clear. The crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar corporation was slowly turning its gaze toward him. And in that solitude, in that quiet space between fear and duty, Tyler made a choice. He reached out, not to his family, who would not hear him, but to a voice outside. A journalist, a man named John Carreyrou, who was asking questions, who was pulling at the loose threads of the tapestry. Imagine the scene. A young man, barely out of university, meeting in secret locations, speaking in hushed tones, handing over the lantern of truth to someone who could amplify its light. It was a terrifying leap into the void. To speak to the press was to declare war on the company, and by extension, on his grandfather. It was the ultimate defiance. He would sit in his apartment, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, wondering if he was making a mistake. The doubt would creep in during the long hours of the night. Was he wrong? Was he missing something? But then he would remember the data, the numbers, the immutable facts of chemistry and physics, and the calm would return. Truth is a lonely companion, at least at first. It asks you to stand apart from the crowd. It asks you to weather the storm without shelter. But it is also the only thing that is solid. Everything else, reputation, money, approval, is fluid. It changes like the tides. But the truth is, the rock that remains when the tide goes out. As the days turned into weeks and the investigation deepened, the rift with his grandfather grew into a chasm. George Shultz, a man of immense power, pressured Tyler to recant, to sign documents, to make the problem go away. The meetings were no longer in the warm living room, but in cold conference rooms with lawyers present. The grandfather he loved was obscured behind a wall of legal counsel and stubborn pride. Tyler sat across from them, feeling very small, yet strangely immovable. They had the power, the money, the influence. But he had the one thing they could not buy and could not manufacture. He knew what was real. And as he looked at his grandfather, he felt a deep, aching sadness. Not anger, just the sorrow of seeing a great man diminished by a deception he could not comprehend. He declined to sign. He refused to lie. He stood up, his legs perhaps a little shaky, but his spirit intact, and he walked out of the room. He walked away from the protection of the Shultz name and into the uncertainty of his own making. As we pause here, let us breathe in the magnitude of that choice, the quiet courage of the young man walking alone into the unknown. The sky above him was vast, the future unwritten. He did not know if he would succeed. He did not know if anyone would believe him. He only knew that he could finally sleep because he had listened to that small, still voice. And in the silence of his own integrity, he found a peace that no amount of accolades could ever provide. The storm was coming. He could feel it in the air. But for the first time, he was not afraid of the rain. The road ahead was not paved with gold, nor was it lit by the flashing cameras of fame. It was a quiet road, a solitary path that wound through the valleys of uncertainty. When Tyler stepped away from that house, away from the heavy oak doors and the legacy that had defined his family for generations, he stepped into a profound silence. It was the silence of a life stripped down to its essential elements. For a long time, the days moved with a slow, heavy rhythm. There were lawyers. There were threats that arrived in crisp white envelopes, words designed to intimidate and silence. The machinery of the company he had left behind was vast, and it turned its gears against him. But Tyler discovered something remarkable during those long, lonely months. He discovered that fear, when looked at directly, loses its density. It becomes like mist, permeable and fleeting. He lived simply. He watched the California sun rise over the hills, casting long shadows that shortened as the day matured, and then lengthened again as evening approached. The seasons changed, subtle shifts in the air, the turning of the leaves, the arrival of the rains. And through it all, he held to his truth like a smooth stone in his pocket. It was the only thing he had, but it was solid. It was real. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from doing the right thing when the world around you demands compliance. It is a hollow feeling at first, an echo in the chest. But slowly, that hollow space begins to fill with a sturdy sense of self. It fills with the quiet confidence that you are no longer acting a part, but living a life. Tyler reached out to a journalist, a voice in the distance who was also seeking the shape of reality amidst the illusions. Their conversations were not dramatic scenes from a movie, but quiet exchanges of facts. Piece by piece, the structure of the deception was mapped out. Not with malice, but with the precision of a cartographer charting a coastline. They were simply drawing the map of what was true. And then, the world began to turn. The story broke, like a wave cresting and finally crashing onto the shore. The secrets that had been guarded so fiercely were suddenly out in the open air, exposed to the sunlight. And as is the nature of shadows when exposed to light, they simply vanished. The fortress of glass and mirrors, which had seemed so impenetrable to the grandfather and so intimidating to the grandson, revealed itself to be fragile. It crumbled. Not all at once, but steadily. The investors, the board members, the public, they all began to see what Tyler had seen in that lab so many years ago. The physics of reality asserted itself. The machinery that did not work could not be pretended into existence forever. But this story, this journey we have been walking together, is not ultimately about the collapse of a company. It is about the restoration of a soul. It is about the healing that comes after the storm. As the truth washed over the world, Tyler found a new kind of peace. It was not the peace of a battle won, but the peace of a burden set down. He could breathe again. The constriction in his chest, the weight on his shoulders, it evaporated. He had walked through the fire of expectation and come out the other side, singed perhaps, but purified. And what of the grandfather? What of the great man who had sat in that library, unable to see the deception? Time, the great softener of edges, continued its work. George Shultz was in the winter of his life. The years were slowing him down, quieting the roar of his past achievements. The relationship between the two men, the patriarch and the prodigal grandson, remained complex. It was a tapestry woven with threads of love and threads of sorrow. There was never a grand moment of apology. Life rarely gives us such tidy endings. There was no scene where the elder man fell to his knees and begged forgiveness. But there was, in the quiet spaces between them, a shifting of the light. As the grandfather neared the end of his days, the noise of the scandal faded into the background. The lawyers went away. The shouting stopped. What remained was the simple reality of family. Tyler, despite everything, held love in his heart. He understood that his grandfather was a man, fallible, aging, and entranced by a dream that was too good to be true. In the final movements of this story, we see Tyler visiting the older man. The tension had drained away, leaving only the stillness of the room. The grandfather, sitting in his chair, looking out at the same view he had cherished for decades, and Tyler, standing there, not as a subordinate, not as a disappointment, but as a man who had forged his own integrity. There is a profound grace in simply being present. Tyler did not need to hear the words, "You were right." He knew he was right. And in that knowing, he found he could offer forgiveness. He could hold the hand of the man who had doubted him and offer comfort. True strength is not loud. It does not need to boast. It is the ability to remain soft, to remain open, even after we have been hurt. It is the capacity to love, even across the chasm of misunderstanding. When George Shultz passed away, the chapter finally closed. The silence that followed was not heavy, but peaceful. The legacy of the Shultz name would be debated by historians and journalists, but for Tyler, the legacy was internal. He had proven to himself that he could stand alone. He had proven that the small, still voice within him was the most reliable guide he would ever have. Now, let us widen our view. Let us step back from the specific details of labs and lawsuits and look at the horizon. Imagine the sky above California, vast and turning a deep, velvety indigo as the sun sets. The Pacific Ocean breathes against the shore, a rhythmic, eternal sound. In and out, in and out. Tyler's journey reminds us that the turmoil of our lives, the conflicts, the difficult decisions, they are all temporary. They are clouds passing across the face of the moon. The moon remains. The light remains. Your inner truth, that quiet center of your being, remains. You may face moments where you feel misunderstood. You may stand in rooms where others do not see what you see. But you can rest in the knowledge that truth is patient. It does not need to shout. It simply waits. It is the bedrock beneath your feet. As you lie here now, let the tension of your own day dissolve, just as the illusions of that company dissolved. Let the worries about what others think of you drift away like smoke on the breeze. You do not need to defend yourself. You do not need to explain yourself. You simply need to be. Feel the support of the surface beneath you. It is solid. It is real. Just as Tyler found solid ground after walking through the uncertainty, you are on solid ground now. You are safe. The storm has passed. The rain has stopped. The air is cool and clean. The world is at rest. Think of the courage it takes to be gentle. Think of the strength it takes to be calm. You possess that strength. It is woven into your breath. It is beating in your heart. As we bring this narrative to a close, let the image of the open sky fill your mind. A sky full of stars, infinite and clear. No secrets, no shadows, just the beautiful, expansive light of the universe watching over you. The story is done. The characters have played their parts. The lesson has been learned. And now there is nothing left to do but drift. To let go of the narrative, to let go of the words, and to float into the welcoming arms of sleep. Your integrity is your squirrel. Your peace is your blanket. Breathe in the silence, deep and restorative. Breathe out the past. All is well. All is clear. All is calm. Sleep now in the quiet truth of the night.